In the wake of the 1966 swamp gas fiasco, the Air Force approached a number of A-list universities to conduct a serious scientific study of UFOs, and was turned down flat. Finally, the University of Colorado, running low on federal grant money, considered accepting. Heading the study would be the respected physicist Edward Condon.
Edward Condon didn't want to do this for the Air Force, even though he'd done a lot of military consultancy work before, because he was like most other people in the scientific community. He thought the whole thing was nonsense and not worth his time. But University of Colorado needed some money.
Robert Lowe, the person who would administer the project, pitched it to one of the university trustees thusly. The trick would be, to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community it would present the image of a group of non-believers trying to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer.
And that was Bob Lowe, the used car salesman, saying what he had to the Board of Trustees to relax them so they could put their imprimatur on the project.
When discovered later, the memo would have disastrous consequences and convince the civilian research groups, who'd enthusiastically cooperated up to that point, that a fix was in. It turned out they were right, but not because of the Lowe memo. As the study was getting underway, Condon and Lowe met with their Air Force liaison, and incredibly they asked him what result the Air Force would like. The leaders of what's supposed to be an inquiry into the reality of UFOs, asking for direction from the agency who'd been proclaiming for 2 decades that there was absolutely no reality to them whatsoever. The liaison officer replied that the Air Force was tired of funding Project Blue Book.
And what he says to Condon is, this project has been a source of a lot of irritation, really, to the Air Force and a lot of expense. And we really need to get rid of this. And if you find that you don't have enough money to come to a proper conclusion, reapply and you'll get more money.
The Colorado study brought on board a team of 8 scientists, engineers, and psychologists. Alan Hynek consulted, as did Kehoe and NICAP, and an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, Dr. James McDonald.
In 1954, he had a UFO sighting, what we would call a daylight disk, and it was really a very puzzling sighting, a good sighting, obviously a very good trained witness. But he didn't do anything with it because he was starting his scientific career.
In the mid-60s, McDonald picked up the study of the phenomenon with a vengeance, reading through all the Blue Book files and the extensive public literature.
He went through all of this in a period of months, began talking with witnesses, was really impressed with the quality of evidence, and he thought that this was the most important overlooked scientific question of the century, maybe one of the most important of the millennium.
McDonald was fearless, vocal, and tireless.
He began giving hundreds of talks, and I mean hundreds of talks, and a lot of scientists in these prestigious organizations began to take an open interest in the subject of UFOs.
But even as McDonald was raising awareness in the wider scientific community, the Colorado study researchers were learning how unusually unaware Edward Condon appeared to be.
You know, he couldn't understand why people were so upset that he had talked about trying to debunk the UFO phenomenon. Well, you know, that to most people that sounds like somebody that's already got his mind made up, and how can we discredit it?
Still hoping for an objective study, the Colorado researchers went into the field to investigate both old classic incidents and some new ones as they cropped up during the course of the study. One such case was the Falcon Lake, Manitoba incident, where a weekend prospector named Stephen Mihalik told of how he had approached a landed disc, thinking it was an American test craft in trouble.
He saw 2 of them. One stayed in the sky and then headed off to the north, and the other one landed over there on that rock outcropping. He progressed and walked up to the door of this thing, which was situated somewhere about here, and put his hand on the side of the door and poked his head in, saw that there were some flashing lights like on a computer, saw that his hand, his glove was melted, very, very hot. And at this time he had already shouted in, "Come on, Yankee boys, need some help? Let me help you fix your machine." And the voices stopped. And at this point, the doors on this thing slid shut, kind of like an iris. And the entire object rotated so that there was a grill or exhaust vent right in front of him. And as he stood right close to it, a blast of hot gas shot out, knocking him down, and then actually setting some of his clothes on fire with the intense heat. And the object took off, rose into the air, and because he was disoriented and distracted, he couldn't tell which direction it went. But he spent some time rolling on the ground, putting out his clothes, taking them off. And then the ordeal of getting back to civilization began, because he was feeling very nauseous, very, very disoriented.
Mihalik staggered out of the bush and got back to Winnipeg, extremely sick.
And I remember going into their bedroom, and even before I stepped over the threshold, the smell in the house and the smell coming from the bedroom was horrible. But for days afterwards, the smell lingered, and the more I visited with him, the more we chatted, the more it felt as though the smell was coming out of him, that he was exuding this stink, that it was pouring out of his pores.
He also had some fainting spells. He had a recurring skin condition as a result, and some burning to his legs too, because when he fell backwards, the blast also caught him on the legs.
2 weeks later, Roy Craig, a Colorado study chemist, accompanied Mihalik, a life photographer, and Canadian authorities in a journey out to the site. They found it suspicious that Mihalik couldn't find the rock outcrop where he claimed the encounter had taken place. There was also a forest ranger tower a mile away, and the ranger hadn't noticed anything unusual in the air. For these reasons, Roy Craig dismissed the incident as a hoax. But in the following months and years, Mihalik's health suffered immensely from no diagnosable cause. That and the official skepticism affected him for the remainder of his life.
What bothered him most was being let down by all of the people he turned to and said, "This happened to me, help me. What is this?" Instead he got, "Well, we're not sure, you burnt yourself on a barbecue, blah, blah, blah."
Meanwhile, back at the University of Colorado, Condon was spending little time with the project. Instead of doing any field investigation, he was enjoying the company of contactees and regaling his professional colleagues with their absurd tales. When Jim McDonald gave a seminar in the summer of '67, Condon fell asleep twice. That same summer, Roy Craig happened upon Lowe's trick memo in the files, the one written to sell the university trustees on the project. Disturbed, Craig showed it to Norman Levine and David Saunders, two of the project's staff who were most bothered by Condon's behavior. Saunders showed it to Kehoe, who gave it to Jim McDonald, who mentioned it in a long letter to Lowe about the negative direction the project seemed to be taking.
Bob Lowe was very, very worried about this, but Ed Condon, typically of him, was explosive about it. He considered this to be an issue of betrayal on the part of what should be a private in-house team. And he called David Saunders and Norman Levine in, and he just fired them. And he not only fired them, but he told them that if he could, he would ruin their academic careers over this.
As threats of suits and countersuits filled the air, Lowe's assistant administrator resigned, citing an almost unanimous lack of confidence in his objectivity.
All these people are falling out of this so-called objective scientific project. They're dropping like flies. And what you have left over is Ed Condon and Roy Craig and a bunch of other people who've basically been added on at the last second, trying to cobble together a mishmash of documents that they called the scientific study of UFOs. Well, it was a terrible piece of work.
The report was immediately hailed by the New York Times science reporter, who it turned out had already written the laudatory introduction to the paperback edition. Its 1,485 pages were prefaced by Condon's 50 pages of negative conclusions, conclusions that dismissed or ignored much of the analysis in the body of the report. Bill Hartman, extremely skeptical about UFOs, had nevertheless concluded about the Trent pictures that all factors appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object flew within the sight of two witnesses. He, in his conclusions, completely ignores talking about that, and in fact infers the opposite. No question.
Yeah, I think infers the opposite is fair. I don't know quite what to say. I think what you're saying is basically right. Whether those conclusions should have been written totally differently, I suspect they should have been. You don't write those things without sort of knowing what the consequence is going to be for people at his level. And I don't know, maybe he's just even more deviously canny than I'm saying, because maybe he just figures, well, if I, Edward Condon, say there's nothing here in this report, nobody will bother to go any further.
Both MacDonald and Alan Hynek fought tenaciously against the acceptance of Condon's conclusions within the scientific community, but it was a losing battle. The Air Force shut down Blue Book, and Kehoe's NICAP went into a steep membership decline. MacDonald sunk into a depression from marital problems and would soon take his own life. Hynek soldiered on, founding the Center for UFO Studies,